All right. This story of Bitmine Immersion Technologies, or BMNR, it's a truly wild. I'm still sort of trying to get my head around this strategic whiplash. It just completely redefined their purpose, like overnight.
Yeah.
It's not just a pivot. It feels more like a corporate shapeshift.
Exactly. And it's all fueled by, well, a staggering $250 million private placement.
Right. And with a very familiar face stepping in, renowned market strategist Tom Lee now as chairman. We are definitely eager to dive in, see how they pulled this off, and what it really means for you, the listener.
It's quite the tale, isn't it? Our mission today really is to explore this MicroStrategy of Ethereum playbook that BMNR is openly modeling its strategy on. I'll try to uncover what this actually entails for investors, looking at the tantalizing potential, but also alongside the very real risks. Things like, significant overvaluation and that looming dilution will help you distill the most important nuggets of knowledge so you can truly understand this high-stakes gamble.
So if you look back at BMNR's history, it's anything but straightforward. This company's been around since 1995, apparently, cycling through different identities for decades, lighting showrooms, oil and gas, renewable energy, then finally Bitcoin mining. For a long time, it was basically just a corporate shell.
Right.
But then, June 2025, things changed incredibly fast. On June 6th, BMNR announced they'd raised $18 million specifically to buy Bitcoin. And by June 17th, they confirmed the purchase, 154.167 BTC. Looked like a clear path, right? A modest Bitcoin miner emerging.
You'd think so.
But here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, kind of brilliant. Just 13 days later, June 30th, they announced this massive $250 million private placement to make Ethereum its primary treasury asset. Bitcoin suddenly relegated to a secondary role. That initial $18 million Bitcoin raise.
Yeah.
Turns out our sources suggest it wasn't really about Bitcoin at all. It was almost like a stealthy piece of financial engineering.
A tactical move.
It's exactly. A maneuver to get that crucial NYSE American listing, which, then opened the door for the massive $250 million Ethereum deal.
It's quite clever.
It really is, using one asset as a stepping stone to a much grander strategy.
Precisely. And when we connect this to the bigger picture, BMNR's new strategy is, like you said, explicitly mirroring MicroStrategy's blueprint for Bitcoin. It's a pretty clear three-step process. First, raise the capital. Second, aggressively buy the digital asset Ethereum in this case. And third, create this leveraged publicly traded equity proxy for Ethereum.
And Tom Lee's thesis behind this?
Well, his central idea is a leverage bet on Ethereum's foundational role, especially as the dominant settlement layer for stablecoins. He put it quite powerfully, saying something like, stablecoins have proven to be the ChatGPT of crypto, projecting that market into the trillions.
Trillions, wow.
Yeah, and his argument is that since most stablecoin payments settle on Ethereum, the network's native asset, ETH, should accrue significant value through network fees. It creates this utility-driven demand that goes beyond just speculation.
Okay, so it's not just buy and hold.
Exactly. And that's crucial. BMNR isn't just planning to hold ETH passively, like, say, an ETF might. That's a core differentiator here. They plan to actively engage in staking, restaking other DeFi activities to generate yield. They're trying to produce alpha.
Right. Returns above the market benchmark.
Correct. They've even defined their primary key performance indicator, their KPI, as ETH held per share. And the goal is to grow that through ETH appreciation, yes, but also by reinvesting cash flows from yield and through future accretive capital market activities. It's definitely an active management approach.
This level of transformation, it obviously required serious capital. I'm curious, how exactly did they manage to secure such a huge $250 million private placement, especially, for a company with BMNR's checkered history? This wasn't just any fundraising round.
No, it certainly wasn't. The deal mechanics involved selling about 55.6 million shares at $4.50 per share. Closing was anticipated around July 3rd, 2025. But what really makes this stand out is the investor syndicate. We're talking blue chip names here.
Right, cool.
Founders Fund, Pantera, Kraken, Galaxy Digital. Really prominent players.
Wow, okay.
And their participation, it isn't just about the money they bring. It's about the massive credibility, the validation, and potentially critical infrastructure support, too. For a company like BMNR, getting investors of this caliber on board, that sends a huge signal to the market.
It really does. Like, hey, some very smart money is backing this.
Exactly.
That's a huge stamp of approval, especially when you consider where BMNR was starting from. what did the financials look like before this massive cash infusion?
Yeah.
Because going from, like you said, a shell company to a major crypto treasury, that implies a pretty dramatic balance sheet shift.
You're absolutely right. Prior to these deals, BMNR was, frankly, in a pretty precarious state. We're talking trailing 12-month revenue of just what? $4.6 million, weak gross margins, operating at a net loss. It's not great at all. Their cash reserves were tiny, barely over $480,000. So this $250 million cash influx, it completely reshapes the balance sheet. It just dwarfs their prior cash and debt, transforms BMNR from, a traditional operating company into one with a substantial digital asset treasury almost instantly.
Incredible.
And it's fascinating that this huge shift is being overseen by a surprisingly small team, reportedly just 7 employees.
Any 7.
Yeah, it really highlights the asset-heavy, operations-light nature of this new venture.
Okay, so this kind of news, obviously it sends ripples through the market.
Yeah.
What was the immediate impact on BMNR's stock price? Because we saw it shoot up, right? From around $4 to peaks over $40. That's just a wild ride.
It was absolutely explosive. The market cap went from maybe $26 million before the news to, well, potentially over $150 million. Some speculative commentary even pushed it way higher at its peak.
But what does that mean for the actual value?
Well, that's the thing. What truly stands out is the extreme premium to its net asset value, the NAV. The pro forma NAV, so what the company's assets would be worth after the deal closes, is around $266 million. But the stock traded at a premium of up to 7.5 times that underlying value.
7.5 times?
Yeah. So you're not just buying a dollar's worth of crypto for $1. You were, at the peak, paying maybe $7.5 for it.
So why the huge premium?
Well, our sources suggest it boils down to maybe 4 key factors. First, there's the Tom Lee narrative premium. The market's buying into his vision for Ethereum. Second, the MicroStrategy playbook. Premium investors betting BMNR can use its stock as currency to acquire more ETH later.
Okay.
Third, a technical market squeeze. Because there were so few shares actually available to trade publicly, the buying pressure got amplified. A low float squeeze. And finally, that promise of alpha from active treasury management, the idea they'll generate returns beyond just ETH going up.
That premium sounds incredible, but it also raises serious questions about sustainability, right? Especially when you factor in the sheer volume of new shares hitting the market eventually. What does that mean for the average investor?
It means we absolutely have to talk about dilution. That $250 million private placement, it represents a nearly tenfold increase in the total shares outstanding.
Tenfold.
Yeah, we're talking a jump from roughly 6 million shares to over 61 million. Now, here's the crucial part. Those 55.6 million new shares, they're currently restricted. They can't be freely traded yet.
Okay.
But once the SEC declares their resale registration statement effective, and that could be weeks or months after the deal closes, they will become publicly tradable.
Which leads to
the float cliff, that's what people are calling it. It could create this massive supply shock, potentially severe downward pressure on the stock. Some commentators are suggesting a possible drop back towards like the $6 to $8 range once all that supply hits the open market. And it's important to understand, too, that the 1-for-20 reverse stock split back in May and the uplisting to NYSE American, those weren't random. They were deliberate, strategic moves to make this huge private placement possible and attract those big institutional investors.
right, setting the stage.
Exactly. Now, the company's plan to offset this dilution is basically to grow the value of ETH held per share faster than the dilution hits. Through ETH appreciation, through yield generation, and, they hope, through future capital raises that are accretive, meaning they add more value per share than they dilute.
It sounds like BMNR is trying to carve out a unique niche, but surely they can't be the only ones seeing this kind of opportunity. Who else is in this space, and how does BMNR really stack up, especially facing that potential float cliff?
You're right. It's not happening in a vacuum. Other players are definitely vying to be the public vehicle for Ethereum exposure. Take SharpLink Gaming, Suspet, for instance. They have a somewhat similar strategy. Big ETH treasury, active staking. But there's a really interesting leadership contrast. BMNR has Tom Lee, the capital markets guy, the narrative strategist. SBET is chaired by Joseph Lubin, who's an Ethereum co-founder, deeply integrated into the ecosystem.
So different bets there. Market savvy versus crypto native.
Exactly. You can see how an investor might choose based on what they prioritize. And interestingly, SBET has reportedly traded at a much lower multiple, something like 1.2 times its net asset value, which really makes BMNR's peak 7.5x premium look, well, even more extreme.
Yeah, that's a stark difference.
And drawing lessons from past crypto stocks is, I think, really vital here. We've seen similar narrative-driven low-float crypto stocks have these dramatic declines. Once the initial hype phase, or crucially when share supply increases, things can unravel quickly. SBET itself reportedly dropped from $120 down to $9 at one point.
Wow, that's a serious cautionary tale.
It really is. It shows how hard it can be to sustain those initial explosive rallies, especially when a flood of new supply is expected.
That makes me wonder then, what's the biggest, maybe existential threat to BMNR's whole model? If the market can get cheaper direct exposure somewhere else, why would they choose BMNR with that premium?
That's precisely the central challenge they face. The anticipated approval and launch of spot Ethereum ETFs in the U.S. that could directly challenge BMNR's value proposition.
Because the ETFs offer.
They'll offer low-cost, liquid, regulated, direct ETH exposure, trading right near the net asset value. So BMNR's main defense against this, their justification for the premium, has to be its ability to generate significant yield through active treasury management. They must deliver substantial alpha, that performance above the benchmark, to justify paying, say, a 50% or 100% premium over just buying an ETH ETF with a tiny fee.
A high bar to clear.
A very high bar. So if we consolidate the major risks that float cliff from dilution and selling pressure, that's the most immediate threat. Beyond that, the stock's valuation is so heavily reliant on the story, on Tom Lee's influence. A narrative collapse is a serious risk if the story loses its shine.
Right.
Then there's massive execution risk. Managing a $250 million digital asset treasury isn't simple. Huge technical, operational, cybersecurity challenges, custody, DeFi risks.
Yeah, a lot can go wrong there.
Definitely. Regulatory risk is always there in crypto. It's an uncertain landscape. And of course, the underlying assets, ETH and BTC, are extremely volatile. That volatility will be amplified in the stock price.
What about those pump and dump whispers you sometimes hear around stocks like this?
Yeah, it's worth addressing. Look, the factors contributing to that perception are pretty clear. BMNR's convoluted history, the crazy volatility, the super rapid pivot, that massive dilution benefiting early investors.
Okay.
But on the other hand, you have to acknowledge the credibility of Tom Lee and those blue chip institutional investors. Founders Fund, Pantera, Kraken. They've staked significant capital and their reputations on this. That's a powerful counter-argument. It suggests there's likely a serious long-term strategic play intended here, not just, short-term speculation.
That's a really important distinction to make. Okay, so given all these moving parts, all these risks and potentials, what should you, our listener, really be watching for? What are the key milestones that will tell us if this ambitious bet is actually paying off or if it's starting to falter?
Okay, key things to watch. First, the successful closing of that $250 million private placement. That should happen very soon. Then how quickly and efficiently they acquire the ETH with those funds, we need to see that happen promptly.
Makes sense.
Next, a detailed announcement of their specific staking and yield strategy. How exactly do they plan to generate that alpha? The market needs details there.
Transparency will be key.
Absolutely. And then, crucially, the effectiveness of that resale registration statement for the new private placement shares, that S1 filing becoming effective. That will be a major test. How does the stock handle that potential flood of supply?
A float cliff moment.
Precisely. The first quarterly report after the pivot will also be vital. It'll be the first real look under the hood at the financials under this new strategy, longer term. BMNR's vision goes beyond just holding ETH. They're talking about strategic treasury deployment in DeFi, governance participation, maybe M&A, even diversifying into other digital assets down the line. It's an ambitious roadmap.
So if I'm boiling this down, they essentially used a small Bitcoin play as a kind of financial Trojan horse to get listed and then go after the bigger Ethereum prize. And now they're trying to be the actively managed version of MicroStrategy for ETH. That's quite a maneuver.
That's actually a pretty good way to put it, yeah. Ultimately, if we connect this back to the big picture, the single most misunderstood aspect of Bitmine Immersion Technologies, I think, is that it's not really a traditional operating company anymore. It's fundamentally a publicly traded financial vehicle designed to give you leveraged, actively managed exposure to Ethereum.
So what does this all boil down to for you, the listener?
Well, An investment in BMNR isn't really about traditional earnings or cash flows, not in the usual sense. It's a highly speculative bet. A bet on the market value of its crypto assets, a bet on the potential alpha from their active treasury management, a bet on the market's confidence in Tom Lee and the team, and a bet on navigating those complex technical dynamics of its share structure, like the float cliff. It's a really fascinating, definitely high-stakes play in this constantly evolving digital asset space.
And I think the central question for investors here, the provocative thought perhaps, is this. In a world where direct, low-cost access to crypto via ETFs is becoming more and more available, can a MicroStrategy of Ethereum, an actively managed one, can it truly deliver the superior returns needed to justify its premium? Or will it ultimately fall victim to the very market forces, like efficient ETF access that it's trying to navigate? That's really the multi-million-dollar question here, isn't it? It certainly is. A lot to think about there. If you found this deep dive valuable, we really encourage you to explore more. Check out our previous deep dives and maybe consider subscribing or getting notified about future explorations into complex topics just like this one. We're always here trying to help you unpack the most interesting and important nuggets of knowledge out there.